Well, welcome to another discussion with Michael Horner, and I'm really looking forward to today's topic here. We've been looking at this myth of enlightened humanism, that is, that somehow the benefits that civilization has incurred and Western liberal democracy has incurred as a result of the teachings of Jesus Christ can somehow still be enjoyed if we set aside the religious aspect of it, if we set aside the fact that these actually were teachings of Jesus Christ, and that we as humans can just continue on from a more of a secular perspective and continue to enjoy these fruits or these benefits without acknowledging or getting involved in any of the religious aspect of things. So Michael, welcome back, and I'm looking forward to what you have to say about this. What maybe would you clarify just by way of introduction here before we launch in?
Yeah, well, we have seen that there are a lot of people a lot of historians who are pointing out that the very values that people think are good about Western civilization and which cause lots of people to want to immigrate to Western democracies to live under these values, that those values owe their origins to Christianity. And so we've made that case earlier in this series. We saw that during the Enlightenment period, though, Enlightenment thinkers wanted to enjoy this fruit of Christianity without the root part. Fruit without the root is what we've entitled it, and I've called that the myth of Enlightenment humanism, that you can have the fruit without the root. In fact, I was thinking, we've done a lot of debates, and one of the number one things that almost all atheists were really concerned about when they were presenting their side of things was, don't tell me we can't be good without God. And I think that is part of this idea. We can be good, we can have the good fruit, but we can do it without God. And I think what we're beginning to see now is the fruit is, there's something wrong with the fruit. And
Yeah.
it just might be it's wrong. What's wrong with the fruit is that we've been trying to do it without God, and now that's beginning to show. And so in our last session, we entitled it Twisted Fruit, Part 1. And so this is Twisted Fruit, Part 2, trying to identify examples of sort of good values that all of a sudden kind of changed in our culture. Over the last number of decades, or maybe it's taken 200 or 300 years, maybe, but this emphasis of fruit without the root is beginning to show problematic features. And so that's what we're going to look at today. We're going to look at some more twisted fruit just to get us thinking about what's been going on.
Okay. Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. It seems that the fruit doesn't seem to be sustainable over a period of just a few generations. We start seeing the fading of that fruit if we cut ourselves off at the root, so to speak. So you've been thinking, I know that you were talking about Bill Maher, and so why don't you just develop that for us?
Yeah, Bill's an interesting guy. I mean, I followed his TV show, 25 years ago, and would get angry at him sitting in my living room from time to time. Recently, I mean, and he's no conservative. He's certainly no Christian, but he is one of this group that has pointed out that wokeism, and I'm not using that as a smear term. It's just a convenient term to summarize sort of postmodernism, critical theory, cultural Marxism, and sort of the more radical left. Bill Maher, his insight is that wokeism seems to be leading to values that look like the opposite of classical liberal values. Well, that's the exact point that we're trying to make here. And so here we have somebody who's not a conservative and not a Christian by any means, and he's recognizing the same thing that we recognize and we're looking at. The values are starting to look disfigured. In fact, so disfigured that they're the opposite of liberal values.
Yeah, turning the opposite.
So we last episode we ended off talking about discrimination and how any response to so-called progressive ideas, and by the way, I'm going to try to use that adjective so-called in front of the word progressive anytime I talk about it, because I mean that's one of the euphemisms in terms of calling radical leftist ideas progressive. I think many of them are regressive, but any
Well,
response. Sorry, go ahead.
C.S. Lewis actually made that point last century, that he was talking about progressive ideas, and his point was is that may not necessarily be a good direction to go if you notice that everything seems to be disintegrating. It seems to be destructive, or there's damage occurring to society. Then the most progressive thing he said you can do is actually turn around, analyze where you left the tracks, so to speak, and get back on the tracks of going in a positive direction.
Gee, maybe we should start calling ourselves progressives then.
The real progressives.
The real
Yeah, the
progressives.
real progressives.
Well, that's like the Conservative Party in Canada used to be called the Progressive Conservatives.
Yeah.
And when I think back on it, that was pretty smart, pretty smart nomenclature at the time. So yeah, any response to so-called progressive ideas that fall short of full acceptance and even celebration is frequently considered hateful and discriminatory. There's no middle ground. If you don't fully accept and celebrate these ideas, you and your ideas are considered hateful, discriminatory, causing harm to people. And I want to add to that often when this hateful discrimination, in scare quotes, is alleged to be happening, it is sufficient for the accusers to point out that the alleged perpetrators of it are religious, or they have a religious source, or religious reason for their views or behavior. And for them, for the accusers, this functions as an adequate justification or excuse to now call out the hate, in scare quotes, and discrimination in any situations where not just tolerance and acceptance, but total agreement and celebration is not forthcoming. And so the expectation that people must change their views or be punished requires them to actually go against their conscience and their core beliefs. I mean, think about abortion or same-sex marriage or even euthanasia or trans issues of people transitioning. If the opposition is viewed as religious, that's enough to we can dismiss that out of hand without even considering the evidence and the arguments that are actually being offered, which are frequently not religious arguments at all. And that makes me think of a thing I used to say. I used to travel and speak on abstinence, both on mostly in university campuses, actually, sexual abstinence, and a little bit in high schools. And but I didn't quote the Bible at people. And I've often said that I can make a strong case for most traditional values just based on the do no harm principle, without using the Bible or appealing to any sort of secret religious knowledge. And then I usually add, and if I'm allowed to use the Bible, I can just make my case even stronger. So the case can be really strong without it being religious for many of these traditional values. And if the Bible is allowed, if the Bible is agreed that to be a authoritative source, then the case just gets stronger.
Yeah.
So this dismissing out of hand of religious arguments brings us back to what we've talked about in earlier episodes, because it's based on the religion is harmful myth, or Christianity is harmful myth that we've been analyzing in this whole series. And the reason that people think that Christianity is harmful is because they've believe that they've seen that it's been used in abusive ways in the past. And we looked at that, right? In earlier episodes with respect to Christianity, the narratives about those abuses, or we call blemishes within Christian behavior, were true to some degree, and we acknowledge that, but they were also routinely, seriously exaggerated, and they weren't consistent with the teachings of Jesus. And more importantly, just because an idea or belief has been abused does not mean that the idea or belief is wrong, bad, or evil. In fact, you can take almost any good belief you can find, you can think of, come across, and it has been abused it has been used in an abusive way. Why? Well, because of the other point we made, because all human beings are flawed. So just the abuse of an idea doesn't guarantee that the idea is bad. It might just be that the people are flawed and are twisted in some way. So some of the twisting of the fruit now that we're going to be talking about is related to an unjustified rejection of the Christian root by unbelievers, by non-Christians, based on these hyperbolic historical narratives about Christian behaviors, the ones like about the Inquisition and the Crusades, and witch trials, and Galileo, all the ones that we went through. That even if there's some truth to them, which we saw there is some truth to them, they don't justify rejection of the root teachings of Jesus and the New Testament. So I just want to put that in at the beginning here before we look at the next example of twisted fruit. So, the twisted fruit of unconditional love. Now, if there ever was a Christian value that's you could really show the origin is in Christianity, it's this unconditional love. I mean, for you and I in the 60s, this became a thing. First in the church, but then it spread outside the church. People talking about unconditional love. But unconditional love in the Christian sense has now become twisted to be acceptance of, well, more than acceptance and celebration of anything someone believes or wants to do. So is that what unconditional love means? Does unconditional love mean that you should accept every person's actions and beliefs? Well, what does Jesus' example tell us? Because Jesus is the source of this idea of unconditional love. Now, it seems clear to me that with Jesus, loving unconditionally means accepting people in the sense of fully valuing the person as one made in the image of God, with equal value, worth, and dignity, but not necessarily accepting all of their actions and beliefs. And before I give Jesus' example here, just reminded me, I was reading bedtime stories to three of my grandchildren, and I've got this series by Bill Craig. It's got written for children. It's Bill Craig's philosophy of religion. It's dumbed down to be read to toddlers and young children. And this is the topic of the one we were talking about was this very point. And these kids understood this. They understood that you can love the person and still hate their behavior, and that their parents love them even though they don't like it when they've done things wrong. So Jesus's message, I mean, initially in the Gospels, the message of Jesus, which was to inaugurate the kingdom of God coming to earth, was to repent and believe. Repent and believe. That was the first steps of his message. He commands us to change. That's what repent means. Repent means to make a 180-degree turn in your behavior and head in the other direction. So repent of some actions and beliefs, and not just accept everything that we do, think, and desire. So Jesus didn't come with a message, okay, everything you're doing is just fine, and everything you desire is just fine, just do more of that. The exact opposite is no. You need to change. You need to make a 180-degree turn, repent of some of your actions and belief.
I think there's I think people need to think maybe a little more deeply about this idea that God is perfectly loving. It's more complex than that because of let's say the line between good and evil runs through every human heart, as Solzhenitsyn said or wrote. And when you have one person who you might love unconditionally harming another person whom you might love unconditionally, then things get a little more complex. But what if there's thousands of people interacting with one another, and there's things that they're doing today that you know in the future, if they're allowed to continue to do these things, great harm will be required. And so suddenly we see that even acting out of love is a lot more complex and may require intervention. And so it's certainly, in fact, it would be the opposite. If you know that in the future, this person, if they do this now and they're allowed, and you affirm that and you celebrate it, and you know that in the future it'll lead to destruction, or the destruction of their own soul, or harm to society, whatever it may be, then it would be, at the very least, unloving to allow them to just walk right into disaster. So
Exactly right.
it's way more complex than the average the people don't think deeply about this.
I think you're right. Yeah. And in John 5:14, after Jesus healed a man who had been disabled for 38 years, he told him to stop sinning and added that continuing to sin could lead to even worse consequences than the physical handicap that he had. And so, like you just said, love doesn't just accept someone's behavior when continuing to do so could harm them. And real love warns lovingly and gently, but honestly and candidly. And we also have the example of the woman caught in adultery in John 8. His love for that woman did not include acceptance of her adultery. Rather, his love of her included his command to go and sin no more. So Jesus knows the truth that God's commands are for our best, and thus the most loving response he could give her was not to lie and tell her to accept her adulterous behavior as morally benign and continue in it, but to tell her the truth that would lead to real flourishing, that she should not accept her adulterous behavior anymore. So Jesus accepted her as a person of value, made in the image of God, but did not accept her sin and told her that neither should she. And if Jesus ever saw this woman again, he would have continued to love her unconditionally, even if he knew she had sinned again. But loving her unconditionally would never require that he accepts the sinful behavior or belief that adultery is morally good or benign, and certainly not that it should be a source of pride for her. The demand that unconditional love requires unconditional acceptance of all behavior and beliefs is not biblical, it's twisted. Unconditional love requires valuing and wanting the best for the other person, which may include telling them truths they may not want to hear.
Yeah. I don't think any of us really enjoys being told that we're heading in the wrong direction. But as you said near the beginning of this discussion, that the data from the social sciences is starting to indicate that following these values that Jesus gave us, without even if you didn't know what he said, just the data from the social sciences indicates that there is a net result of flourishing to civilization, society, on the long term if they follow these values. On the short term, it might seem like a great idea to abandon certain traditional values, but in the long term, they're not just crafted for short-term consequences, but for long-term as well.
Right. Next example of twisted fruit, the twisting of the golden rule. Confucius had a golden rule. It was, don't do to others what you don't want them to do to you. That's a pretty good start, but it doesn't go far enough because it lacks the kind of action to which Jesus called his disciples to. Confucius was, don't do this. Jesus was, do unto others what you want them to do unto you. Matthew 7:12. Now, some people claim that this means that you ought to treat others the way they want to be treated. I've heard this a lot. The golden rule, you ought to treat others the way they want to be treated. So a person who wants to be treated like a woman, even though they are a biological man, well, therefore I ought to treat them like a woman. But the golden rule that Jesus says, I ought to treat others the way I want to be treated. It's not saying since someone wants to be treated a certain way, I ought to treat them that way. All right, our next example of twisted fruit is the twisted fruit of authenticity. Now, the idea of being authentic, being honest with myself, and being honest with others about myself, about my thoughts, my desires, has now kind of morphed into demanding that my every desire be celebrated as good and beautiful. So authenticity now is actually leads to getting rid of the whole concept of normal. Why? Well, because if there's such a thing as normal, and if I honestly feel different than that, and want to be different than that, then I've got to get rid of that normal, or else my desires would not be considered good or beautiful. And that would be an attack on my authenticity. So human nature, including biological sexual reality, is pejoratively labeled normativity these days. And that's a smear term, normativity. And it's considered an oppressive system. Why? Because someone else has a desire to be something other than what the biological sexual reality is. And so now something good and beautiful like authenticity, I should be honest with myself. I should be quit trying to fool myself and fool other people, now becomes a weapon to destroy the idea of what is true, good, and beautiful and normal.
That's a good point, Michael. It's like you're violating. There's a feeling that if there is something normal out there, let's say some standard, and I'm violating that standard of, let's say, beauty and truth or something, that that one solution to that is just say that belief in such a standard is wrong. We just need to do away with this normal standard here and live the way, which frees us up to live without having to think that we're violating some standard. But on the long term, if this standard of values leads to the flourishing of civilization, to abandon that is actually to depart on a course of destruction, for a long-term course of destruction for civilization.
Yes, for sure. Our next twisted fruit is the twisted fruit of equality. Equal value of all human beings has now become twisted to become equity, which is equal outcomes for all human beings. So equal worth is the value that's being identified here. But that is not interchangeable with sameness. Just because someone has equal worth and value doesn't mean that they are the same or that they are identical. And it certainly doesn't mean that everyone should have the same amount of everything. That is not the same thing. It's something different, and it's a slight twist from the original equality into what's called equity. So equity can only be achieved by forcefully taking from some people and giving it to others. So all of a sudden, equality demands forcefully taking from some people and giving it to others, and that ends up being based on the sin of envy and covetousness. One of the 10 commandments, that we shouldn't be acting that way. So that's a major twist, and that's part of the woke thinking that has become really dominant in the last decade or so.
Yeah, it reminds me of a command in the Old Testament that they were not to pervert justice by deferring to a rich man or deferring to a poor person. And you might think, well, the poor person needs help here. But so maybe we should just, let certain things slide, maybe not demand the same justice there as we do here. But in the long term, he says that's not just unjust, but what he's really concerned about is the ongoing or long term perversion of justice.
Right.
So once you start this idea of equal outcomes for all human beings, despite whatever they've been doing or not doing, you begin to go down the road of a perversion of justice, which in the end also leads to the collapse of a civilization.
Right, exactly. Impartiality is important, and the Bible points that out. Next, twisted fruit, the twisted fruit of human dignity. The idea that all human beings have equal value, worth, and dignity. And there's a very strong case that this is based on the Judeo-Christian teaching of human beings created in the image of God, and it's called the Imago Dei. But this is an interesting one. This now has become twisted into dehumanization. So in other words, sort of the idea of human exceptionalism, that human beings have value, worth, and dignity, and everyone has it, and it's equal, now slidden down the road to dehumanization. So Carl Trueman is a really good thinker these days, who's written a lot, and in his article called The Desecration of Man, he said, the unique intellectual brilliance of our species has, ironically, deprived us of any sense that we have special significance. Technology changes so fast that we're unable to assimilate one development before another overtakes it. The result is a dizzying feeling that our ability to control even our personal worlds is constantly slipping further away. In such a context, the questions of who we are and what we are meant for become impossible to answer. Things seem constantly falling apart, and that includes the consensus on who or what man is and what he is for. He adds that to mock religion is, in effect, to mock the understanding of God and humanity that religion represents. And then he says, there's an irony in man's genius and its nihilistic outcomes. During the scientific revolution, man used his exceptional intellectual powers to convince himself that he was not exceptional at all. Think of a speck on the tiny blue pale dot in the vast universe and so on. Today, he combines his willpower and with his technological talent to turn himself into Play-Doh. That is, to make himself into whatever he wants to be. He persistently seems to use his humanity to dehumanize himself. And then just building on this, Russell Moore, a Christian thinker, recommends a book by Tara Isabella Burton called Self-Made, Creating Our Identities from Da Vinci to the Kardashians. And Burton argues that, quote, we have not so much done away with the belief in the divine as we have relocated it. We have turned our backs on the idea of a creator God out there and instead placed God within us, more specifically within the numinous force of our own desires. In a tale as old as Eden, the attempt at self-creation doesn't lead to deification of human beings, but dehumanization. The story of self-creation at its core, she says, is a story about people figuring out together what it means to be human. It's a story about trying to work out which parts of our lives, both those parts chosen and those parts we did not choose, are really authentically us, and which parts are mere accidents of history, custom, or circumstance. It is, in other words, a story about people asking and answering and asking once again the most fundamental question human beings can ask: who am I really? And it's a story of how one answer, and Moore says, in my view, the wrong one, became dominant. I am whoever I want to be. So, human dignity has been twisted into dehumanization as we see our place in the universe, maybe, or as we look in at our own desires and kind of become our own God. But I can
Yeah,
be whoever I want to be.
I think that's in the end, kind of depressing. I've got enough life experience behind me now to start spending time at the deathbeds of various people, friends and relatives. And this delusion that we are who we want to be, I think gets real thin as death begins to approach, and you realize, is this it? Is this all there is? Have I been living? I lived how I want to be, and I know I've seen a couple of funerals now where they play the song "I Did It My Way." I
Yeah,
think it's
yeah,
by
yeah,
Frank Sinatra.
yeah,
It's the most depressing thing. Maybe
yeah,
when you're young, that seems kind of bold and courageous, but when you see that person in their final days, wow, like this is not going in the right direction. Without God to give us divine value and significance, if you take that away, it just life becomes a joke.
yeah. Dehumanized.
Yeah,
Dehumanization is what takes place.
dehumanized.
You're exactly right. Yeah. The next twisted fruit, we did talk about it briefly in the last episode, but I want to say a little bit more about it. It's the twisted fruit of freedom. Freedom moving from freedom to do something versus freedom from something. So the following is from the philosopher and historian John D. Wilsey. And he says, freedom is not simply doing whatever one pleases. Freedom is not the epitome of relativism, subjectivity, or so-called living my truth. True freedom, he says, is ordered by just law. And a freedom unmoored from morality results in disorder, the turning of the world upside down. For freedom to be real, it must be ordered in morality. And then he actually goes through a summary of Western tradition here that extends beyond Christian teaching. It was around even before Christianity fit right in with Christian teaching. But he says our inheritance from the Western tradition, going all the way back to the Athenian Thucydides in 460 to 395 BC, has consistently distinguished between freedom and license. Freedom results when there is a just law to live by, whereas license is the doing of whatever one pleases. And he's pointing out now that the ancients understood the difference here. Reality stays the same, no matter what one thinks of it or how one attempts to change it in the name of freedom. One cannot define reality on one's own terms. The conditions of reality are set for us, and freedom obtains when we submit to that reality and order our lives based on reality. And reality is moral. Even before Christ, Aristotle wrote, quote, men think that freedom means doing what a man likes. Everyone lives as he pleases or according to his fancy. But this is all wrong. Men should not think it slavery to live according to the rule of the Constitution, for it is their salvation. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus asserted in his discourses that a life lived by the principle of I would have everything result just as I like and whatever way I like is insanity, not freedom. So even the pre-Christian Stoic philosophers saw that. The Christian theologian Thomas Aquinas argued in the Summa Theologica that free people in society are directed to their good by a just law. And this would be true even if there were no sin. And finally, the Enlightenment thinker Montesquieu argued in Spirit of the Law that virtue was the basis for freedom, and without virtue, the state perishes. He likened license to the life of a fugitive. The fugitive is thrown off constraint for a time. He lives on the lam. The fugitive seeks to live above the law rather than under the law. In contrast to license, liberty can consist only in the power of doing what we ought to will and in not being constrained to do what we ought not to will, Montesquieu says. So his point is we live in Western tradition. We've always believed and lived this way, that we must refuse to accept that, live this way that I've just described. And he goes on to say, we must refuse to accept the left's attempts to redefine reality and redefine freedom. Freedom is only freedom when it's ordered. Disorder springs from license, the doing of whatever one pleases. Freedom under law results in human flourishing. License and disorder beget tyranny. And then John Stonestreet of the Colson Center, I think, gets it right when he says, how a culture understands freedom, whether as a means of cultivating virtue or as a means of achieving immediate gratification, just determines the culture's stability. As Os Guinness wrote in his book, A Free People's Suicide, the greatest enemy of freedom is, ironically, freedom. Specifically, the greatest enemy of freedom is poorly defined freedom, or what Chuck Colson called freedom without virtue. So it seems to be very easy for freedom to get twisted into license. And I think our culture kind of goes back and forth on this. Even non-Christians can see that license doesn't produce good results. But there's always seems to be a strong push towards almost like a total freedom, total autonomy.
Yeah, that I guess what you've said here, this idea of redefining freedom is a problem, because maybe if we thought more carefully about what do I mean when I say I want to be free, what would have to go along with that, and I would like to think that flourishing would be part of that. I am free, and whatever that means, the end result should be that life becomes even more fulfilling and I flourish even more. But let's say if I'd like to be free to fly, say by leaping off a cliff, I might actually feel free for 1 or 2 seconds, but then as I'm laying at the bottom of the cliff, if I'm still conscious amidst a lot of broken bones and stuff, there are genuine consequences for me wanting to feel that I'm free of the law of gravity, and the consequences are not something we can decide arbitrarily I'm going to be free of. And so when I'm thinking about freedom, I have to think about the consequences. And I think this might be what he's getting at, is that human freedom, you can decide you're free to do whatever, but you can never decide you're going to be free of the consequences. Is it really freedom if you find yourself absolutely shackled with consequences, devastating consequences?
We run right up against reality. Yeah, and I'm glad you used the word flourishing there, because that's the word we have been using throughout the series. That what leads to proper flourishing, or what hinders proper human flourishing, and that's the right word to use here in terms of it's the proper understanding of freedom that leads to flourishing, and the improper understanding, like total freedom in the sense of license, does not lead to human flourishing.
It leads to an increase in human suffering. I guess true moral values would minimize human suffering and maximize human flourishing.
Right.
Those are the consequences.
Right. So what's going on today is that there's a move to replace traditional virtues and values with so-called progressive virtues and values. And in an excellent article called G.K. Chesterton and the Value of Tradition, we introduced Chesterton, I think, last week or the week before on this. But this law student from Queen's University named Callum Anderson wrote this about 4 years back. I tried to look him up and see where he's at right now in terms of his law degree or practicing law, and I couldn't find anything. But he wrote this very good article, and here's what he says. He says, anti-oppression training is a means to this end, an attempt to inculcate progressive virtues in students and professionals, while at the same time eroding and vilifying traditional virtues. Anti-oppression training is flawed because it's impossible to cherry pick virtues and still keep a coherent belief system. So this is now entering into this whole discussion we're having about different virtues, and some are getting twisted. And so now he appeals to G.K. Chesterton, and he says, Chesterton said it best when he compared Christian virtues to the seamless robe that Christ wore before his crucifixion. So this is an analogy or a metaphor that Chesterton's using. And here's the quote that we used from Chesterton before that Anderson is giving now. He says, the modern world is full of the old Christian values gone mad. The virtues have gone mad because they have been isolated from each other and are wandering alone. Thus, some scientists care for truth, but their truth is pitiless. Thus, some humanitarians only care for pity, and their pity is untruthful, is what Chesterton says. And he says, and they have parted Christ's garments among them, for his vesture they have cast lots, though the coat was without seam, woven from top throughout. So it's a quote from John's Gospel. And so Callum is pointing to this cherry picking of virtues. And he says critical theorists have attempted to divide interlocking Western virtues, of all these virtues that kind of fit together like a giant puzzle. But they've tried to divide them by portraying them as oppressive notions, which the dominant culture has foisted upon minorities. And then he points to the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, which described rational thought, which is called prudence, and a strong work ethic, fortitude, and the nuclear family, which displays temperance, and taking responsibility for one's actions, which is justice, as, quote, aspects and assumptions of white culture. So those four things, prudence, fortitude, temperance, and justice, are just aspects and assumptions of white culture that can be dispensed with.
You just wonder how. Okay, well, let's imagine as a thought experiment a culture where there is no rational thought, there's no work ethic, and there's no nuclear family. You just, I guess, people breed like dogs, I suppose, and there's no taking responsibility for one's actions. What kind of a society is that, and why would we possibly give any credence whatsoever to this person's in the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture? Why would we give credence to somebody just making an assertion that seems to be against, well,
Against human flourishing.
Against human flourishing.
Yeah.
Like, would you like to live in a culture like that?
Yeah, exactly.
Not at all. It'd be anarchy. It would be every person for himself in the end.
Right. And so right along with that, former New York Times editor, Bari Weiss, in a lecture that she gave at the Federalist Society's National Lawyers Convention. Now Weiss is not a Christian. I'm sure she's Jewish, and she's not a conservative by any means. And this lecture was entitled "You Are the Last Line of Defense," speaking to the lawyers at the Federalist Society. And she gave a description of woke's ideology's twisting of values. So as we're ending this section on twisted values, we're kind of looking at what's coming out of the woke thinking right now. And she says it seeks to upend the very ideas of right and wrong. It replaces basic ideas of good and evil with a new rubric: the powerless, good, and the powerful, bad. It replaced color blindness with race obsession, ideas with identity, debate with denunciation, persuasion with public shaming, and the rule of law with the fury of the mob. And I thought that was a good summary to where we're at in this process of the fruit coming out of the Enlightenment period, originally rooted in the Christian values as the resources that help the fruit grow, to where we're at right now. And the fruit without the root concept of Enlightenment humanism is inherently unstable, and we're living in it right now. Without the root, the fruit just isn't going to last, at least not in a healthy way. Without enough people in a culture believing in the root of Christianity, the fruit of Christianity will not last, especially when the root is being marginalized and mocked and forbidden from public influence. And that's what we've been living under for a while. But it worked for a while. This fruit without the root thing worked for a while. And that's what's so hard to kind of figure out what we should do now, because it worked for a while, living off the resources of Christianity that were present within Western civilization.
And the momentum.
Yeah, and it wasn't even that much Christian values, really. I mean, it wasn't as though all the people who were called Christians were living perfect lives. No, I mean, a very small minority were really even following the teachings of Jesus. And there was pushback against Christianity, but there was enough of the teachings of Jesus that had kind of become part of the Western culture, that it provided what was needed for this fruit to grow, that brought the world the most positively transformational changes in human history, producing a culture that millions of people around the world are still willing to undergo great risk to gain access. So that's the data, that's the facts we have to wrestle with. But the fruit without the root ultimately reduces to living a noble lie, for the atheist. But
I'm not sure it's noble, Michael. Like a noble lie?
yeah, that's a good
It seems maybe an insane lie, really. If you want to abandon rational thinking and you want to be ruled by the fury of a mob and public shaming, like what kind of...
Well, I think what was noble in their mind was, we can live these values without God. We don't need the root. And it was noble that they recognized the values were good, I guess. But it's, and in a sense, for what we're going to come down to here is, should Christians be imposing Christian values on society? Because we know best, we know that's going to produce the fruit, and if the other people don't listen, well, we need to impose it. Well, I'm not going to go there. I do not think that works, and I don't think it's what Jesus taught. And so what we've been living under is the Christian root was there, but we sort of allowed, in a sense, the unbelievers to go with their attack on the root and say we can live without God and all the supernatural stuff. We can do it in order to share the common ground that we both agree the fruit is good. So let's try to make it happen. And so what this is getting at is, what should we do now? Now that the fruit is becoming twisted, significantly twisted, what should we do now? Should we just return to, okay, let's try to have the fruit without the root? Because the alternative is, we're going to have to impose the root. And I'm saying, well, no, we can't go there either. So is there some middle ground between imposing the root of Christian belief on culture, which I don't think we should do, versus just doing nothing? Is the middle ground this idea of fruit without the root? And is that the best we can do, all the while Christians still continue to share the gospel, and hopefully more people believe, and more people believe in the root, which will thus produce the fruit? But it just leads to, what should we do in engaging culture? And that is the question that we have to deal with now.
Yeah, it's almost like a train wreck in slow motion. And once the train wreck has occurred and gone so far, it's hard to unwreck the train without basically a totally new rebuilding of the tracks and rebuilding of the train. That seems to have happened in history from time to time, when a society just collapses. It just becomes a train wreck, so to speak. And out of the ruins and the rubble arise people who still have values. I'm quoting from J.D. Unwin here. So it's the people who held to those strong values. And he wouldn't call them Judeo-Christian, he might call them traditional, because there is a remarkable similarity across many different people groups, ethnic groups, and so forth, of what we might call traditional values. And held to those are the ones that tend to rebuild a civilization once it has collapsed. The rest tear into each other, like, let's say, the fury of a mob when a pack of wolves, one wolf is wounded, a couple that get wounded, they start turning on each other, tearing each other to bits. And you just can't get into that. You just have to let them destroy themselves and look to, is there anybody here left that can rebuild civilization? Now, I'm assuming we're just factoring out the intervention of God himself, where there does appear to have been major spiritual awakenings in history that actually have rescued cultures.
Yeah.
Rescued the US, for example, in the mid-1800s. But again, if we're going to trying to talk and ignore God, that is actually an ignoring of a certain reality too, maybe the ultimate reality.
Right.
So, but I think probably you and I might say at the end of the day, if you really want long-term fruit that's sustainable, you're going to have to go with the root, but it can't be, it's not imposed from without. I think the way God seems to work is he works within each individual from within. And when enough people within a society begin to see, wow, something's gone terribly wrong and I don't want this, then...
So we're going to get into that, what do we do, in the next episode. But I want to finish off this episode with kind of what you introduced here. You know, what happens to society if we go down this fruit without the root? And a lot of people have been commenting on that. So the philosopher John Gray talks about what happens when free societies deconvert, societies that have Christianity as the anchor. What happens when they deconvert? And he says we're headed for an age of all-consuming moral warfare. And so Bonnie Kristian, a writer for Christianity Today, was reviewing John Gray's writings, and she says his story of liberalism's decline is set squarely within church history because liberalism, as Gray rightly observes, is a footnote to Christianity, specifically to Protestantism. I mean, that fits in with what we were saying right at the very beginning. Modern liberalism and the positive things about it have grown out of the values of Christianity. And he says that's evident in the explicit claims of key thinkers like Locke and its major principles. And Gray summarizes the major principles of liberalism as to 4 defining ideas, which are actual continuations of Christian monotheism. 1, the primacy of the individual is a secular translation of the belief that each human being is created by the deity, which has an authority over them which transcends any worldly power. 2, the egalitarian belief that human beings have the same moral status reproduces the idea that all human beings are equal in the sight of God. 3, liberal universalism, the belief that generically human attributes are more important than particular cultural identities, reflects the idea that humankind is created in God's image. And 4, the belief that human institutions are indefinitely improvable replicates the theistic faith that history is a moral narrative of sin followed by redemption. And these 4 ideas can stand alone, Gray says, attracting adherents and building governments in purely secular terms, which is what has happened since the Enlightenment. But the historical link with Christianity is real, as is Christianity's function, although not its only function, but one of as a cultural context in which liberalism can thrive. So this is the gist of John Adams' famous saying in the Declaration of Independence for the United States that said, our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. So then what happens as the West deconverts? Our culture's post-Christianity and it's post-liberalism go hand in hand. And pundits are making the claim that we are in a post-Christian society, we are in a post-liberal society. Christendom is supplanted. He says when this happens, Christendom is supplanted by a perversion of Puritanism. I'm not sure if I agree with his understanding of Puritanism there, but it's probably a perversion of the perverted understanding of Puritanism, bloated with rules and bereft of redemption, no redemption. And so my summary of this is that he's talking about wokeism here. That is a natural step out of Enlightenment humanism, the skeptical secular humanism. Wokeism is now full epistemological skepticism. It's skepticism in everything, including science and all knowledge. Plus, wokeism is come out of a Christian birthed humanism. Humanism was birthed out of Christianity, but wokeism is sufficiently weaned from the Christian root of love, forgiveness, and redemption. So now this is an example of the fruit where the root, we've been completely weaned from the resources of the root, and that's wokeism. So Christian values, Gray says, continues to be widely authoritative, if not often practiced, but unmoored from their theological matrix, they become inordinate, which means excessive, and extreme. Society descends into a state of moral warfare, unrestrained by the Christian insight into human imperfection, which we talked about as being the real problem a few episodes ago, the fallenness of humanity. So the woke elite person, gleefully conniving in the destruction of traditional morality, is pitifully unprepared for the savagery that ensues when it breaks down. He says liberalism has been a pretty solid house, but we've gotten behind on the maintenance, and many of those with the most tools to hand are chucking them in the trash. The 21st century underclass are offered no place in the scheme of things. That is, the average man on the street, Gray says, is offered no place in the scheme of things. They are treated instead as retrograde specimens of humanity on the wrong side of history, or what one famous politician in the United States called the deplorables. Gray is pessimistic about restoring liberalism. A Bill of Rights may be useful in codifying liberties and entitlements, but it will be viable only insofar as it expresses values that are widely shared in society. We are culturally post-liberal, even if our institutions haven't quite caught up. And the next stage, Gray predicts, is a breakdown of law. For Gray, any project of reviving the liberal West is a prescription to a diseased old man to simply become young again and try a second life of superhuman virtue. The old man prefers simply to die. But I agree with the writer, Bonnie Kristian, who's writing this review of John Gray's article or book, The New Leviathan. When she responds, our duty, I submit, is to do what is required to live in a free and orderly society. And that sort of wish for death over duty is intolerable. And so she quotes R.G. Collingwood, a Christian scholar during World War II, who wrote, duty admits of no alternatives and requires of us to be constantly overcoming one's own passions and desires and living at the somewhat high and arduous level of mental adultness. In other words, we need more people willing to be the adult in the room, but this time the room is the whole culture. Why? Well, because we value our civilization and we keep ourselves by our own free will up to the standard we now recognize. So we recognize that Christianity produced something beautiful and wonderful in the last 250 years here, or that came to fruition in the last 250 years here. And we're just not going to let it go without a fight. And so she says, our duty is to seek freedom with restraint, for it's the only alternative to the new Leviathan, that is the new woke monster, the new hegemonic woke monster, which basically is leading to endless constraint in the name of freedom. That's what wokeism offers. In the name of freedom, we're going to give you endless constraint and shackles. And so I think she's absolutely right here. That democracy without values leads to totalitarianism. Even the Pope John Paul II's encyclical Centesimus Annus back in 1991 warned of a tendency to claim that agnosticism and skeptical relativism are the philosophy and the basic attitude which correspond to democratic forms of life. He saw the problem there. He says, predicted that a democracy without values easily turns into open and thinly disguised totalitarianism. And that's the stage we're at right now. Ethics without metaphysical foundations are about as helpful as bumper stickers. And so John Stonestreet and Maria Baer of the Colson Institute say, if nothing else, secular humanism is a cautionary tale for Christians who think of the Christian faith as a kind of humanist project. Of course, we want to be respectable, intellectual, good people who make the world better. But Christianity is not merely a way of achieving human flourishing, even though we've been talking about that. It is, but it's not merely that. It is first and foremost a story of reality, an account of the world and human history that is true. The story is the foundation of certain non-negotiable moral beliefs that may not be popular, but they are also not up for grabs, and they can't be separated from the truth claims of Christianity in the first place. And so that leads us into our conundrum. What should we do about the situation we find our culture in? Fruit without the root has led us to this current situation, twisted and disappearing fruit. So should we be promoting that same thing again? A non-imposing, pluralistic, persuasive view to the non-believer? I'm actually going to answer that question in the next episode, and the answer is going to be yes, because I'm against the only other alternative, which is imposing it on other people, and I don't believe that works.
Well, look forward to that, Michael. It should be a fascinating episode, and your proposal as to what the solution to this gigantic train wreck is.
I'm going to appeal to unbelievers and believers, and I hope enough unbelievers will listen and engage with what I have to say, because the very branch we're all sitting on is being sawed and sawn, and it's almost
Ready to snap.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you again, Michael, for your insights on this, and we'll look forward to the next episode.
Thanks for your input too, Kirk. Your input was really valuable.
Oh, you're welcome, Michael. Bye for now.